All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 16, Capital and Labor. And what capital and labor means is capital, generally speaking, is referring to big business. As we will learn in the time period after the Civil War, the American economy grows rather rapidly, creating some very big and powerful businesses. And labor refers to essentially workers. And this relationship kind of explores not just each of these things individually, but also the relationship between big business and workers. And already into the introduction, we are provided at least a little bit of a glimpse for how the relationship between big business and the working class could be like. And that was, at times, it could be especially violent. We're introduced with the scene from the Great Railroad Strike. The Great Railroad Strike is one of the largest, say one of the, actually, technically, maybe not largest, one of the, we'll say, most widespread strikes in US history. It was a strike that initially had started in places like Pennsylvania. In other areas, it turned violent. Militias were called in Pennsylvania. They were called in places like Maryland. Strikes broke out in other cities across the United States. And so, because the railroads was an industry that spread across the entire country, it meant that when railroad workers went on strike in one area, railroad workers went on strike in other areas. And so, this is what we mean by the most widespread. If you're not entirely familiar, a strike is a tactic that is often used by workers in order to get better working conditions. This is a refusal to work to gain, we'll say, better conditions. A refusal to work in order to gain better conditions. So this was true for railroad workers really across the country. And because the railroad business was kind of the first quote unquote big business in American history, that's one of the reasons why this strike was so widespread. And as you might imagine, when workers refuse to work, that typically means for the other side of the equation, big business, they're not going to be making any money. And oftentimes, worker demands were met with violence. We got a quote here from the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1877. His response to when workers refused to work, he said, a quote, a rifle diet for a few days and see how they like that kind of bread. In other words, he wanted to use violence in order to break up the strike. And that's exactly the kind of image that we are shown here, right? Depicted here. When the Great Railroad Strike, when the dust settled in all these different areas across the country, about 100 people were killed in the Great Railroad Strike, about $40 million of destruction. And for the most part, and this is what we'll find is often kind of frequent in this era, is that typically the workers aren't really any better off, sort of as a result to that. So this is definitely a chapter here where when we think about the relationship between business and labor, there's definitely the potential for violence. And in fact, probably throughout of all of American history, it's in this period after the Civil War that, in fact, the relationship is the most violent. Right? Okay, so section 2, we'll go ahead and focus a little bit more on the business side. That is the march of capital and the economic growth in the United States following the American Civil War. Much of the economic growth in the United States could be attributed to various technologies. And there were all sorts of different technologies that were invented in this period, but three that really have kind of a very significant impact. The first one is steel, and really kind of an improvement to the way that steel was made. Following the Civil War, steel could be produced more cheaply, and the steel itself was much, much stronger. and steel is going to be used to build anything from railroads to skyscrapers to bridges. It really does kind of provide the infrastructure for the United States. The second big technological advancement here is electricity. And electricity will begin kind of as a sort of as like a novelty. You'll find kind of like lit up signs and it'll be used for entertainment, but electricity will have a very practical use, especially when it comes to things like, providing lighting inside homes and even things like powering factories. Electricity is going to be kind of one of those big technological advancements. And the last one is something that we just referred to, and that is the railroad. Now, it's not to say that railroads were technically invented in this period. In fact, the United States did have a significant rail network even during the American Civil War, but railroads will explode across the United States, and that will really be the backbone by which kind of all other businesses can thrive. Railroads are often called the first quote unquote big business. And we're talking about big, not just in terms of like economics, because there's certainly, you can certainly add up like the dollars and the investments and the evaluation of companies, but we also mean big by influential. Some of these railroad companies in the period after the Civil War would be more influential than politicians, more influential than even cities or counties, or maybe even some states. So they do become very, not just very important for the American economy, but do also have a very kind of profound impact on politics. So all of this technology attributed to kind of the more efficient production of goods. We sometimes refer to this as the mechanization of production. So we'll say that production utilized technology to produce more for cheap. In fact, sometimes this time period goes by the name the machine age. And that is very much kind of reflective of the way in which machines really sort of assisted production. Now, there's going to be kind of all sorts of different repercussions when it comes to the mechanization of production. Again, this is something that was kind of already happening regardless leading up to this period. We talk about mechanization primarily as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, but technology is one of those things that just kind of continues to build on itself. So we'll just mention kind of two quick consequences here of the mechanization of production. One is that you move from a more skilled labor force to unskilled. The more sophisticated the machine, really the less that is required of people to operate it. Oftentimes, this meant that people were required to perform the same task over and over and over again. It could be a very simple task like pulling a lever or pushing a button. And because as long as you pulled the lever or pushed the button, the machines were sophisticated enough to kind of do everything else. So we definitely see a rise in unskilled labor during this period. And there was also kind of like a, what's kind of a good way to describe this. This might not be kind of the perfect description, but there was maybe some sort of or a greater pride in work before, to this sort of psychological toll on people. And this is not a perfect analogy, but back when people kind of built stuff with their hands, or at least it required a little bit of know-how, there's a certain kind of pride and honor that you took in your work. But as machines continue to replace people, as the task of people continue to get simplified and simplified, there really is sort of this like psychological toll. Work kind of loses its honor. You lose your pride in your work. Pulling a lever, pushing a button, 12 hours a day, every day, there isn't that same type of feeling towards work. And of course, there are kind of other consequences that come with mechanization. Of course, the benefits here are, well, for the consumer side, more is being produced and it's more cheap. So it's not to say that mechanization was only a positive or only a negative. There were some benefits to it, primarily on the consumer side, people buying things. But as a worker, right, in this chapter, capital and labor as labor, mechanization provided some problems in the workplace and new challenges. Businesses became especially, effective and focused on profitability, so much so that an entire science around making as much profit as possible really flourished in American businesses. This is sometimes referred to as scientific management or Taylorism, and this is the science of making production as efficient as possible. So, these experts would be brought into a factory, they would observe it for a certain period of time, and they'd be able to tell the owner, look, here's a way that you can save a penny here, save half a penny here. You do this, you should do this instead. And really the whole purpose of it was to really kind of motivate profit, right? More profit the better. But oftentimes, what the experience for workers was that a lot of this scientific management came at the expense of workers. So we'll also just add this is the science of making production as efficient as possible, often at the expense of workers. So I'll just give kind of a quick sort of example here. We have here, a photograph from the Glacier Stove Company, 1900 to 1910. We have a group of men here that are working very difficult. But one thing that could be suggested by the scientific managers was, instead of having something like, let's say a group lunch where everybody goes to lunch at the same time and you might be able to fraternize and talk to your coworkers during this time, scientific managers came in and said, look, it's not efficient for everyone to have lunch at the same time. Instead, there should be sort of like stratified lunch times, that a certain number of people go eat lunch, but the rest of the people keep working. And so in that way, you're kind of having lunch maybe like alone, or at least with fewer people. So group lunches were replaced by, we'll just say, more efficient lunches. All right, that was just kind of one example. There are lots of individuals who use the technology and use scientific management in order to make more efficiency. Probably one of the most well known was Henry Ford. Henry Ford is the founder of Ford Motor Companies. And Henry Ford was not the inventor of the automobile. Automobiles had existed prior to this time. But what Ford did was invent a way to create automobiles so they could be pretty much purchased by everyone, that they could be affordable. He's known mostly for the assembly line. And the assembly line was, we'll call it a method of car production that made the cars affordable. Sometimes it's said of Henry Ford that he, quote unquote, democratized the car. He created a way to build a car that most people could afford. And really, before that, automobiles were kind of like toys. They were toys for the rich. They were more like a yacht, for example. So again, not the inventor, but certainly very influential in terms of allowing the car to be affordable for a lot of people. And his invention of the assembly line, this is a perfect example of scientific management. If you're not familiar, the assembly line is a way of production in which each individual person performs the same task over and over and over again. So, for example, in building a car, instead of just having one person or a group of people build the car from the ground up, you have one person put on the wheels. And when they're done putting on the wheels, the car is brought over to another person using electricity, using electric power. And then that person puts on the frame. And then the car is brought to the next person. That person puts on the steering wheel. So the same person is always doing the same task, but it's that the car is moving from production to production to production to production. And it ends up making it very, very, very affordable, a lot more affordable than the past. So, with all these technological advancements, with sort of changes in efficiency and production, the United States economy grew rapidly. By 1900, U.S. was the largest manufacturing country. Manufacturing means building stuff. Manufacturing. And by 1913, U.S. manufacturing was greater than France, Germany, and Britain combined. So we're talking not just in terms of a huge increase in production from like a US perspective, we're talking about a huge increase in production from a global perspective. The United States becomes the manufacturing capital of the world. And one kind of important thing to kind of feed into this theme of big business is often the ways that technology worked. We sometimes use this term economies of scale to describe not just what was going on in the United States following the American Civil War, but to describe very specific types of manufacturing. And what economies of scale more or less means is that the more sophisticated the technology, the bigger the factory, the more investment that you put in, the greater efficiency you get out, not simply at a one-to-one level, but at an exponential level. So we might say that investments in production yield exponential outputs. So let's just kind of do a quick example here. So let's say we have two factories, right? Factory A and factory B. And factory A, make it simple this way. Factory B is twice as big, twice as expensive as factory A, right? So you've put twice as much efficiency here. What economies of scale says is that when you increase the investment, you don't just increase the output by a direct one-to-one thing, right? Conventional wisdom might state, okay, well, I double the size of the factory, I should get double the output. That's actually wrong. Economies of scale says that when you increase the investment, the output increases exponentially. So a factory that is twice as big might yield 10 times as much in terms of output or in terms of production. And so what this ensures is that, the bigger the factories, right, all the factory Bs, they're going to be able to outproduce smaller factories, and they're going to be able to outproduce them rather significantly. And so there's a certain consolidation of businesses that occur in the United States. And you even find this in terms of like certain geographic areas in which certain businesses thrive. So, for example, we'll just use a couple of examples here. Pittsburgh really became the nation's producer of steel. Chicago, a lot of animal products. were made in Chicago. Chicago. We'll just say the Northeast or New England textiles. And that is to say, in those regions, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New England, they had the biggest and largest and most sophisticated factories, and they were able to produce much more efficiently than any other factory really across the country. So there is definitely this consolidation of business, and it's one of the reasons why businesses become so powerful, particularly in this area, right? It's kind of all feeding into one direction. Now, as far as the ways that businesses organize themselves, most businesses organize themselves via a corporation. A corporation is we'll call it a business structure. And the reason why businesses organized in corporations was because one, it was easy to raise investment. You can do this by selling stocks in a company. And you can think of a corporation as being kind of like a separate entity, right? So take a business today like McDonald's, right? McDonald's is not a person, it's not a single individual, it is a corporation. And one of the things that McDonald's can do in order to raise money is they can sell stocks of their company. And so when you buy a stock in McDonald's, you're not giving your money to any individual person. You are essentially kind of giving it to the corporation. So it makes it a lot easier to raise investments. And the second reason is that it limits liability, right? If somebody pours hot coffee on your lap when you're in the McDonald's drive-through, you don't sue the person that did that, you sue the corporation. And so in some sense, every investor in the corporation is not liable, it's the corporation that is liable. Another way you can think about corporations is that corporations will continue to exist even when people come and go, right? McDonald's, in theory, can exist as a corporation forever. But the people who are investors or owners or managers or workers or whatever it is just kind of come and go. And so these corporations kind of exist as their own separate entities. And when they become very big and very powerful, they can have a lot of influence, not just over the economy, but really over politics, right, and society more broadly. So corporations really thrived in this period, right? Really thrived in this period. Now, one of the major limiting factors on the consolidation of wealth and power by business is competition. And ideally, in a free market, what kind of keeps prices in check, what keeps the workplace safe, is that there are competitions between businesses. Businesses won't charge too much money because they're afraid that somebody might undercut their price, or they're incentivized to treat their workers with a certain degree of safety and kind of goodwill because they don't want their workers to go and work for a competing firm. And so, from the perspective of business, from the perspective of profit, competition really can be a problem. And there were lots of ways in which businesses got around competition or um, managed to avoid it in order to become more wealthy or more profitable. The first way was price fixing. And price fixing was just an agreement to raise prices, right? Or at least not to lower them. And businesses could engage in this pretty openly. The second way was by establishing pools. And pools were kind of like informal, we'll call them quote unquote back room meetings between competitors to increase profit. Increase profit. And again, pools were relatively common in the day, but price fixing and pools were only good insofar as the participating members agreed on the price. Oftentimes, price fixing arrangements and pools were broken, right? You might have businesses agree as some sort of informal arrangement, and then one of the businesses decide to change their mind. And so businesses got a little bit more savvy in terms of finding ways around competition. That was finally to create trusts. And trusts were essentially like pools, but they were more concrete. They were legal entities. This is a legal entity, kind of like a corporation, a legal entity where competing businesses were owned by the same group of people. So it gives kind of an illusion of competition. So you might have, I don't know, Coke and Pepsi, and on the surface it might look like Coke and Pepsi are competitors to one another. But what if you found out that in fact Coke and Pepsi are actually owned by the same person? If that was the case, then competition, keeping prices stable, incentivizing good working conditions, none of these things would essentially work. So price fixing pools and lastly trusts, again, which were much more concrete, were all ways around competition in order to make more money, right? And that, of course, was the goal at the end of the day. We're also introduced here a little bit later in the chapter about the great merger movement. Oftentimes, what happened when businesses became so efficient, they put other businesses kind of out of business. The great merger movement was a consolidation of businesses in the US. Um, yeah, we'll just go ahead and leave it at that. And when businesses consolidated into like one single entity, we refer to that as monopoly. So monopoly is an industry in which there is one single firm, business. So if you control only one single thing, and there are no other producers, then essentially you could charge whatever price that you want. Section 3, the rise of inequality. So it's true, businesses were really bigger than ever in the United States because of technological advancements in scientific management. But as wealth consolidated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and as it became more and more wealthy, the difference in wealth equality grew significantly. In fact, so much so that this time period is often referred to as the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age is kind of a very helpful descriptor of this period. This was a term that was coined by the famous American author Mark Twain, and something that is gilded. Maybe we'll just go ahead and gilded over here is gold on the surface. And the reason why Mark Twain decided to describe the United States as gilded in this period was that, sort of on the surface, we might say, on the surface, the United States was growing economically, was growing in terms of the military. It was golden, right? But most Americans were suffering. Think about the beginning of this chapter, business and labor. Yeah, businesses were doing great, right? Businesses were making a ton of money. They were the biggest businesses that ever existed. The Gilded Age is a time period where you have some of the richest people who had ever lived. The United States became an industrial nation. It was becoming a world power. So there's a lot of reasons as to why this was a golden age for the United States. But the reality is that as soon as you scratch below the surface, there was kind of an ugly side to American society. And so this was the kind of suffering that we might describe as this period. So Gilded Age is very helpful in describing what exactly was going on here. In fact, a lot of people would be very critical of this time period and very critical of the people who made a lot of money in these kind of mega businesses. A very common term that was used to describe the extra wealthy was robber baron. So this was a term to describe the very wealthy. And it gets sort of its name from kind of both of these pieces here. So the term robber implies that their wealth was stolen, right? That these individuals who became the richest people, not just in American history, but in the history of the entire world, really didn't earn their wealth. And the term baron, this was a title of European nobility. And what I'm writing on this photo here is a picture of the home that Cornelius Vanderbilt lived in 1904. And you can see that it almost does look like a palace. And again, the idea was that given the history of the United States, there had never been such a thing as American nobility. The United States came into existence, after kind of that order was established. But the idea was that these were individuals that were so powerful, they were kind of like above the law. They were kind of like kings in some respects. So the fact that they had stole their wealth, they didn't actually earn it, and the fact that they were these kind of powerful nobles, that's where the term robber baron comes from. And again, it was sort of a negative term. Um, there are two robber barons that we ought to be familiar with. Rockefeller. And John Rockefeller was in the oil business. And the other one is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was in the steel business. And really, John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie are kind of your prototypical robber barons. They're some of the richest people to have ever lived, much wealthier than even some of today's, hyper billionaires. And they embodied kind of this idea of the robber baron, a person whose power and influence and wealth is just, light years ahead of everyone else. And so, one of the ways in which people like Rockefeller and Carnegie justified their wealth and influence was by kind of newer ideologies and theories that really sort of fed in to the rich get richer mentality, none more significant than social Darwinism. So, social Darwinism gets sort of its legs from Charles Darwin, who was known for his theories on evolution. And Darwin's ideas came out in the late 1850s and were really, really, really powerful. But Charles Darwin and his ideas applied to the natural world, right? This was only for animals. It was people who took Darwin's ideas relating to nature and then applied them to human society is where we get social Darwinism. And really, it's kind of a misapplication of these ideas. These are Darwin's ideas applied to human society. And essentially, what it said was that society is like nature. and that the most quote unquote fit will rise to the top. So, to allow human societies, or the human economy, really, American economy, kind of treat it like the natural world, don't do anything, don't intervene, and the most fit will rise to the top. And this was convenient for people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who could then turn around and say, look, I deserve all of my money. I deserve all of my influence because we are, quote unquote, the most fit for society. Social Darwinism was founded by Herbert Spencer. Again, it wasn't Charles Darwin. Herbert Spencer, we'll call him the founder of social Darwinism. And this was one of the major prevailing ideologies of the time. This quote here helps represent the idea of social Darwinism. It says, quote, the strong must grow stronger, and that they may do so, they must waste no strength in the vein of trying to uplift the weak. Baltimore Sun, 1907. So social Darwinism was very much kind of a rich, get richer mentality. And you could say, look, the government or any other entity should not intervene in the economy because it might disrupt sort of the quote unquote natural order of things. And so, social Darwinism, as we'll learn in later chapters, was not just kind of an important ideology in terms of domestic policy, but it also applied to um, foreign policy as well, right? This is a big kind of motivating factor at home and at overseas. We'll take a moment just to view one of the photos here. This is a photo titled 5 Cents a Day by Jacob Riis. 5 cents a day would refer to the amount of money that, let's say, like a worker for Andrew Carnegie's steel plant might receive. And you can see from this photo that in order to survive, people oftentimes had to split living quarters, sometimes even the same room or even share a bed. In this photo, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 6 people huddled into one area. And because workers were paid so low, and again, why were they paid so low? Well, ideas like social Darwinism prevented any type of government action. Profits could be greater when workers were paid low. Unskilled work. Actually, let's go ahead and sort of list some of these things. So, contributions to low pay. Just list some of these things here. Again, unskilled work because of machinery. And these are things we've only talked about so far. Unskilled work. When machines do all the skills for you, it means that pretty much anyone can do the job. So if it's a question of who can pull a lever and who can push a button, well, unskilled work doesn't demand higher wages. It demands lower wages. So as the workplace became more mechanized, it meant that workers themselves actually were paid much less. We have less competition, right? If there's only one steel plant to work for, then there's nothing incentivizing that steel plant in order to try and make working conditions better or try to raise pay. If you can't quit your job to work for someone else, then they could pay you pretty much as little as possible. Talked about social Darwinism. Again, the idea that the government should not step in and maybe provide better pay for better pay for workers. And there are other kind of factors that we'll get to in some of the next section, but we'll just go ahead and label 3 here. Actually, let's do one more. Profit, of course, this is a big one. Why should Andrew Carnegie pay his workers as low as possible? Well, the less money that he gives to his workers, the more money he can keep for himself. So again, just in the section so far, we've got 4 factors for why pay is being suppressed and why workers are earning less and less money. Now, there is a sort of internal contradiction, or maybe not internal, but there is a contradiction to the amassing of wealth and power by big business during the Gilded Age and the theory of social Darwinism. And that is the fact that the reality is that the government did not completely leave businesses alone. In fact, there's lots of government intervention that took place during the Gilded Age. We talked about several examples in the last section, right? Government stimulus. The political party that was really focused on building up the American economy was the Republican Party. Remember, the Republicans in the last section were the party of the North. This is true, but we're also going to label them as the party of business. And this was incentivizing things like railroad construction, the Homestead Act, establishing greenbacks. All of these things were government actions to stimulate the economy. We're going to touch on one last thing here, and that is the point about tariffs. Now, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And tariffs are really kind of designed to do one thing and then have sort of the reality of doing another. Now, what tariffs are designed to do, they're designed to protect US business from foreign competition. And the idea is that when foreign competitors are able to outproduce the United States, outmanufacture the United States, one thing that you can do as a country is you can tax those imports. And that allows for American businesses to kind of have the upper hand. And that's really what tariffs are supposed to do. They're supposed to protect American businesses from competition. The reality during the Gilded Age is that tariffs allowed US business to make more profits. All right, moving on to section 4, the labor movement. So we have a pretty good idea at this point how business became very powerful and influential in the Gilded Age. Now it's time to look at labor. And by labor, we're mostly talking about urban workers. These are workers who live in the cities and they're working inside these massive factories that are owned by people like Rockefeller and Carnegie. So, whereas things were looking golden for the business side, things were looking a lot more dire, we might say, for the labor side or for the urban workers. And so, there are kind of several things that we can say about the conditions of the working class as the Gilded Age progressed. First and foremost, workers worked very long hours in the factory, oftentimes 60 hours per week. So these were very, very long days. It's also true that the workplace became more dangerous. You can think about kind of heavy machinery and the way that it could possibly injure or even kill people. Things like accidents, fires. All of these things made the workplace more dangerous than it was in the past. The bigger, the badder the machine, the more potential that machine could do harm to human bodies. And workplace accidents, workplace deaths, workplace injuries, all of these things increased during the Gilded Age. And these two things combined really made it a lot more difficult to support families. We talked last section about kind of the pressures on wages, how workers were increasingly being paid less, but also because the work was unskilled when it came to factories, it meant more people could do that. And in a later chapter, we're going to talk about one other kind of compounding issue, and that is the issue of immigration. This is also happening at a time where the United States is experiencing really historic levels of immigration. So while the factories are kind of de-skilling the workplace, allowing for a greater potential pool of people to work, immigration also kind of compounds that issue because now you have a higher or a larger pool from people to choose from. And one of the consequences that we find in the Gilded Age is because of all these factors, the growing nature of child labor. If a child can do it and you can pay them less because the task is much more simple, well, why not have children? And in fact, in many industries, children were preferable. And so, through the kind of deterioration of the urban worker, they're not going to simply just kind of like sit back and allow this to happen. We'll find that urban workers will fight back, in some cases, quite literally. This image here is showing you a textile strike in 1912, and you can see that some sort of police or national guard are called out with rifles. So there were several ways in which workers could potentially fight back, and it didn't always mean literally fighting back. One of the most effective ways for workers to improve their condition during the Gilded Age was to form unions. Unions were organizations of workers who tried to get better conditions. And one of the most common tactics was to go on strike, right? That was a refusal to work. Oftentimes, unions were much more effective than just like workers trying to bargain on their own. It's one thing for a single individual worker to ask for a raise. It's another thing for all of the workers in a factory to ask for a raise. And so there is a certain kind of, with union, a certain sort of strength in numbers, right? A strength in numbers. So as far as unions go in the Gilded Age, there's only two of them that we're going to have to know by name. The first one is the Knights of Labor. All right, so this is a worker union. And the Knights of Labor was, in some case, described as one big tent for all. They were very kind of open in terms of who could become a member and who couldn't become a member. So the Knights included both men and women, and what we might say native and immigrant, and also skilled and unskilled. In other words, there was no sort of like threshold for what job you need to have in order to be part of the Knights of Labor. So, kind of one big tent for everybody. Lots of people could potentially join. The Knights of Labor, though, they suffered a little bit from kind of their sort of idealistic goals. The Knights of Labor had, quote, what we might describe a sweeping vision. They were looking for essentially like changes, or we might say wanted, maybe like societal and economic change on a large scale. On a large scale. So they were a little bit more, maybe this is a better term, maybe a little bit more radical. They had kind of big plans in terms of what they wanted to do, things like worker owned factories to change the system of capitalism. They really wanted or really had some of these sort of big ideas. Now, as far as unions go, they could oftentimes find themselves confronted with violence. And in fact, the Gilded Age is one of the most violent time periods between business and labor. With that being said, for the most part, unions wanted to avoid violence, although it did happen on occasion. There's going to be a couple of incidents in which we're going to talk about here about specific violent confrontations. Please recall from the earlier section that we already mentioned one. That was the Great Railroad Strike. All right, so that was already one example, 1877. Another example is the Haymarket Riot of 1886, which happened in Chicago. And this was a riot or strike that initially started for an 8-hour workday. And during the strike, the workers would gather, and sometimes individuals would like give a speech to the crowd. The police, who were kind of concerned about the trouble that this might cause, were ordered in to break up the strike. A bomb was thrown at the police. And it ended up killing 7 people. The police fired back, killing 4 people. So a grand total of 11 people lie dead as a result of the Haymarket. And one of the significant things about this riot was it began to draw the connection between labor unions and radicalism. And this was kind of a difference in approach in terms of how to address the problems that workers faced. And not all people agreed on that. So when it came to things like unions or unionism, this might be something like going on strike, refusing to work in order to get higher pay. But radicals could advocate a whole series of different positions, from the use of violence. That is to say, look, the only way that us workers are going to get what we deserve is if we take it violently. It could be ideas or ideologies like anarchism. And it could be maybe other ideas like, socialism, which we'll talk about at the end of this chapter. As a consequence of the Haymarket riot, 4 were convicted. Actually, well, 4 were executed for the bombing. Pretty much with not good evidence. And for the broader American public, this was an incident that kind of made a lot of the American public maybe like a little bit more scared of unions. There was kind of this question about how radical they were, and sort of their willingness to promote violence. We could certainly say that as a result, the Knights of Labor, unions like the Knights of Labor, became less popular because of the Haymarket riot. And it really kind of forced governments to take a much more militant approach when it came to workers' unions, to establish police forces that could deal with whatever the working population was in whichever American city we can choose from. So the Haymarket riot was a blow to workers. Not only did they not get an 8-hour workday out of it, but they also got kind of associated with more radical and violent ideas. And so it was in the aftermath of the Haymarket riot that other labor unions, like the American Federation of Labor, otherwise known as the AFL, began to gain in popularity. And the AFL differs from the Knights of Labor in a lot of different ways. First and foremost, it is far more exclusive. That is, mostly it is native, white, men only, and skilled workers. It is not one big tent for everyone. They are very specific on who they let in and who they don't let in. And in terms of their approach, if the Knights of Labor is radical, we would definitely call the American Federation of Labor more conservative. But again, don't be so confused, because even just advocating for better pay and safer conditions and government intervention, that was not necessarily the conservative position. The real kind of conservative position is more like social Darwinism, right? Darwinism. So definitely more conservative, I would say, of the labor unions. But in regards to like business and government, the AFL is still advocating for like new ideas, right? New approaches to the workplace. In terms of their goal, they were more practical. The Knights of Labor, sorry, the AFL, they were not interested in kind of grand, idealistic, sweeping change to the economic and political structure. They just wanted a little bit more money, safer conditions, more days off. They had more concrete goals. And for that reason, the AFL is actually the more successful of the two. The AFL becomes or is the longer lasting union in that respect. There are two more incidents of violent confrontations that we ought to note. Another one here is the Homestead Strike. This took place at Andrew Carnegie's steel plant. And their workers went on strike and were met by what was often a kind of common tool used by businesses when workers went on strike, and that was to hire private security. The owners of the factory went to the Pinkerton detectives. These are like private, we can call them security, maybe call them like a militia, right? Kind of like your own personal army in some sense. So people like Carnegie were certainly wealthy enough to like hire their own army if it was necessary to go fight the workers. So this was a private security / militia, we'll say, used by robber barons to break up strikes. And so the Pinkerton detectives were called in to Carnegie's steel plant at the Homestead strike, engaged in a shootout with the workers, but the workers successfully defended the plant. And one of the reasons why the workers would keep the plant or the factory kind of hostage was because oftentimes a tactic by business leaders was to bring in what were known as strike breakers. Again, there's a large pool of workers that are available. And so if your workers are going to go on strike and refuse to work, one thing that you can do is just fire all of them and then bring in new people, right? Bring in strike breakers to break the strike. So these are the people that are brought in when workers go on strike. And so not wanting that to happen, what they did at the Homestead strike was when they refused to work, they also wouldn't let anybody else come in. So the Pinkerton detectives were called in. They were supposed to take back the factory. They failed in doing that. And you had a kind of a standoff occur between the workers and Carnegie's steel plant occur for, I think it was weeks or maybe even months. Eventually, the state guard was called in, and the state guard successfully broke up the strike. And the union was destroyed. And this is very much characteristic of the experience of workers during the Gilded Age, is that they find themselves on the short end of a lot of these battles. There's a lot of hard-fought battles, but none of them really end in the favor of the workers. Kind of the last major confrontation between capital and labor during the Gilded Age was the Pullman strike in 1894. This was once again a railroad strike. And the railroad strikes were potentially the most disruptive and damaging, because if you look at something like the Homestead strike or even the Haymarket riot, these are workers in one place going on strike. But the railroads, they're everywhere. And so the Great Railroad Strike kind of revealed to business leaders and politicians that if the railroad workers go on strike, there's potential for striking workers all over the place, right? And that's what kind of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 sort of revealed to the general public. The Pullman strike was shaping up to be very similar, right? Very similar. The leader of it was Eugene Debs, leader of Pullman strike. And again, here I believe the Pullman workers were receiving a pay cut, and so they went on strike. And so if the Pinkerton or if private guards couldn't do the job, it usually fell to the state government. And if the state government couldn't break the strike, which in this case, the state refused to intervene. If the state government can't be relied upon, then it is the federal government. And in the Pullman strike, the federal, and we're talking about United States here, intervened and put down strike. So really for workers, whether it was local or federal government, they really found themselves, or they found that local and federal governments always tended to side with the interests of business over labor. So when we think about the Gilded Age, it's a time period not really where labor experiences kind of real significant improvements or changes, but it's definitely a time period where labor is organizing, fighting back, making their voices heard, and some of those changes are going to come a little bit later down the road. All right, section 5, the populist movement. So, in the industrial cities and the urban areas, the rise of big business, the working class, and the conflicts that break out with them. But there's an entire other segment of the country out there, and those are the farmers. And for all the changes that are taking place in the cities, farmers are still the majority of Americans. And the Gilded Age also meant significant changes for them as well. As far as farmers go, the technological advancements, the mechanization, also had a negative effect on them. Now, again, we said that technology and mechanization is good for production. Production goes up, efficiency also goes up. So, as consumers, we're typically happy with technological innovation. But it also has the effect of falling prices. Now, again, as consumers, we typically think that the lower the price is, the better. But if you're a producer, if you're a farmer, if you grow something, you actually want higher prices. So, falling prices via technological improvement, this was actually bad for farmers. It meant that they would make less money as a result of this. So, falling prices are one kind of issue that farmers face during the Gilded Age. Another issue is the way in which farmers become more dependent on big business. And there are two businesses in particular, two industries in particular, which farmers are really kind of under the thumb of during the Gilded Age. First ones is the railroads. And the railroads can pretty much, can and do charge farmers really whatever price to move goods. As a farmer, after you grow your food, you're really left with no other choice but to use the railroads in order to transport it. And at a time where the railroads are really the only effective way of transport, it meant that the railroads could pretty much charge whatever price that they want. And so oftentimes things like price gouging were very, very frequent. I mean, in some ways, we could say that the railroads for farmers, I mean, this was a monopoly. Depending on what area one was in the country, you really had no choice but to pay the railroads whatever ransom they asked. And so railroads exercise more control over farmers. And the other industry is banking. And there's another fact about mechanization and technology, and that is it is expensive. Right? It's going to cost a lot of money for sophisticated irrigation. It's going to cost a lot of money for a sophisticated tractor. But as a farmer, you really need to buy the latest technology because if you don't, then you're simply going to go out of business. And again, in terms of the banking industry, we could say that farmers were forced to take loans to buy expensive machines. So when we look at the industries that farmers really have a gripe against, it's really the railroads and the banks. And if you were a farmer that, took out a loan in order to buy this machinery and your business didn't go that well, then oftentimes the bank would take your land. And so farmers began to express kind of attitudes politically about the ways in which the railroad industry and the banking industry were really kind of squeezing them out. We have a quote here that kind of reflects the growing influence and power of big business, not just in the eyes of the urban workers, but also in the eyes of farmers. It says, quote, "It is no longer a government by the people and for the people, but a government by Wall Street and for Wall Street." If you're not familiar, Wall Street is where the stock market is located. It's the financial kind of center of the United States. And so essentially what Mary Lease is saying here in 1890 is that we, the ordinary people, whether we're a farmer or worker, we have kind of lost our government to the interests of business and we need to take it back. And so farmers in some ways, you definitely can draw similarities between farmers and workers. Again, we're talking about two different groups of people, two different settings. Workers are typically in the city, farmers are typically in the rural countryside, but they do have some overlap in terms of the grievances that they have. And much like the urban workers, the farmers are going to employ some similar tactics in order to try and improve their condition. Like workers' unions, farmers create organizations. Farmers' alliances are organizations of farmers to work together to really improve their condition. So this might involve, something like, sharing expensive equipment rather than buying it on your own, or maybe pooling resources together to buy an expensive tractor, and then all members of the alliance can use it. It means trying to negotiate with railroad companies about fair prices or negotiate with banks for fair prices on loans. So we find very similarly that, yes, farmers are also willing to organize together and use sort of a strength in numbers. But one way in which the farmers kind of went beyond the urban workers was in creating a new political party. And that really is kind of one of the unique responses that we find amongst the farmers. The People's Party or the Populist Party is a new political party founded in the Gilded Age. Really to advocate for farmers. Now, some of what they say ends up being very much appealing to other segments. So there are some workers that like what the populists are saying. There are some socialists that like what the workers or that the populists are saying. But this is more or less born out of necessity. The two political parties at the time, the Republicans, earlier we had said that this was the party of business. And the Democrats really aren't that much better. Just to give you an example, it was a Democratic president that put down the Pullman strike. So the idea is that very much the two choices on the table, the Republicans and the Democrats, the Northern Party and the Southern Party, both of them are kind of on the side of business. The question is, well, who is on the side of everyone else? And the answer is no one. And so the Populist Party really is supposed to be the party of the people, right? People versus business interests. And so in 1892, members of the Populist Party meet in Omaha, Nebraska, and lists kind of a lot of different things in terms of what they want to change. We're going to go ahead and list four things. There are more than four parts to the Omaha platform, but we're going to see kind of the ways in which the Omaha platform reflects the reality of people living during the Gilded Age, mostly farmers, but other groups of individuals as well. So some of the things that they advocate for, the populists do first, are government loans to farmers. This would, in effect, one, the government was already in the business of providing loans to businesses like railroad companies. The government was in the business of like creating colleges. So the idea that the government could help the economy wasn't completely foreign, although advocates of social Darwinism would say that they shouldn't do that. But this would help break the monopoly of the banks, right? So that the banking business wouldn't have such a stranglehold over farmers that they could get their loans from the government. Another way in which farmers sought to kind of break the stranglehold from the banks was to monetize silver. And what that means is that to allow silver to be part of the money supply, at the time, it was only based off of gold. And since there was only so much gold in the world, and because banks controlled most of the gold, therefore they controlled most of the money. We had a gold standard back then, meaning that the amount of money in circulation was tied to the amount of gold. What farmers want to do, and the reason why that was important was because when there's only a limited amount of money available, and when the banks own all of that money, or they own a lot of it, it means that money is very expensive, that loans are very expensive. So it's very hard for farmers to get their hands on money. So what the farmers wanted to do is say, look, instead of just basing the money only off of gold, why don't we go ahead and also add silver to it? And if we add silver, that means that the total overall money supply would be bigger, because now we're counting both gold and silver. And with more money, that means we as farmers, we can get our hands on it. Loans will be cheaper. And both of these things were really designed in some ways to kind of break, we might just make the point here, this and this was to break banking control, right? The control that banks had over farmers. The third point here is a little bit more clear, and that was to nationalize railroads. And what nationalize means is to put it in the hands of the government. So in the same way that like a street outside of your house, nobody actually owns that street except for typically the local government. And so what the farmers wanted, they wanted the railroads to kind of be like the streets, that everybody can use them, that they're part of the country, they belong to all of us, that they shouldn't belong to a private business that is looking to make money. So by nationalizing the railroads, allowing everyone to kind of use them freely or use them with taxpayer dollars, this was a way to break the control of the railroads. And we might just put sort of another point here as far as what the populists wanted. They wanted a graduated income tax. By graduating income tax is a tax on your income, the amount of money that you make. Graduated meaning that the more money you make, the more money you pay in terms of taxes. And so this would be used, the graduated income tax could be used to take over the railroads and to provide funds for farmers, right? So this is a way of increasing revenue. We'll go ahead and just add one more point here, and that was the secret ballot. The populists also wanted some sort of political reforms. We haven't yet talked about this, but the Gilded Age is one of the most politically corrupt time periods in American history. And so expanding democracy was also kind of an idea behind the populists. So again, all of these disgruntled farmers are saying, look, we've had enough. We've already tried working together. Now we're going to create our own political party and try and get people forward. Now, for both the populists and the urban working class, there proved to be some factors limiting their effectiveness. And one of the big things in that was the kind of racial and ethnic divisions that characterized American society. So one thing that kind of prevents both the Populist Party and workers' unions like the AFL and Knights of Labor from really kind of reaching their potential are kind of the differing sort of racial attitudes. And we see this very much with the Populist Party as well. So, for example, with the farmers' alliances, there were also segregated alliances, especially in the South. That is to say, only white farmers organized and only black farmers organized. The Colored Farmers Alliance was an all African American alliance, which really had to kind of constantly combat racism. They weren't able to work together with the white farmers' alliances, and that really prevented them from being more influential and powerful overall. This sort of sentiment is expressed in this quote here by a populist politician, Marion Butler, in 1900. He says, quote, "We are in favor of white supremacy, but we are not in favor of cheating and fraud to get it." Section 6, William Jennings Bryan and the Politics of Gold. So the Populist Party was making certainly some noise, but this was still an era in which the two mainstream parties, the Democrats and Republicans, were still firmly established. The Populists by 1896 wouldn't really have any kind of realistic chances of winning the presidency, but they were making enough noise that some of the other mainstream political parties were paying attention. And also, some young, charismatic politicians were beginning to pick up on the populist sentiment. One of them was William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan began to champion many of the populist ideas, specifically bimetallism. And bimetallism is the monetization of gold and silver. That is to base the money supply not only on gold, which was the case at the time, but also add silver into it, right? Buy like bicycle two, bimetallism, two metals. And this was a position that was really in stark contrast to kind of contemporary politics because it was specifically challenging the power of the banks. Now, William Jennings Bryan was a member of the Democratic Party. And so when he was trying to win the nomination for the 1896 election, we should just mention that 1890 presidential election. Essentially, the Democrats had to choose, okay, are we going to choose kind of an old school Democrat that is kind of pro Gilded Age, pro social Darwinism, or are we going to choose this guy, William Jennings Bryan, who is beginning to espouse a lot of these different kind of populist views? At the National Convention, William Jennings Bryan gave a speech called the Cross of Gold speech, in which he said, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." Again, we can think about a cross of gold as being sort of like big banks. And by extension, this was big business. So he was obviously invoking the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and kind of playing on the familiarity that the audience had with Christianity and pretty much making the comparison in the Gilded Age saying, look, we, the people, we're being persecuted by the banks. We're being persecuted by big business. We're being crucified on a cross of gold. And with that speech, the Democrats decided that they would nominate the populist Bryan, which was kind of a difficult choice to go with. And so now, seemingly, the Populist Party, which again kind of didn't favor either of these two parties, had a very difficult decision, and that was: do the populists continue to operate independently, nominate their own candidates? At this point, they had gotten 6 senators elected, so they were making some steam as a very serious third party. But now they have a party in the Democrats and a candidate in Bryan who, at least according to this image, here you have Bryan, who is a populist party snake, and he is eating the Democratic Party, is essentially taken over. do the populists decide to support the Democrats? And ultimately, what the populists decided to do was to throw their support in with the Democrats, that they would not run separately, but they would go with the Democratic Party in hopes of getting Bryan elected to the presidency. Now, on the other side of the 1896 election, we had the Republicans, and the Republicans nominated William McKinley. And William McKinley was kind of your old school, uh, kind of pro business, pro gold, pro tariff, right? Because remember, tariffs represent the interests of businesses. Um, Kind of old school pro business, pro gold, pro tariff, Gilded Age politician. And the 1896 election was a stark contrast in kind of these two different candidates. Bryan was the young, charismatic guy speaking to the needs of the masses, the disaffected farmers. He had gone on trains across the country, giving sometimes 3, 4, 5 speeches a day. William McKinley ran what was called the Front Porch Campaign. He pretty much never left his home in Ohio, but he had the backing of big business, right? He had the money, he had the funds, he had the backing of kind of the traditional political establishment. And at the end of the day, the result of the election was that McKinley won the 1896 election. And with that, with McKinley's victory over William Jennings Bryan, it effectively led to the ending of the populist movement and the ending of the party. Populists had kind of thrown in their support with the Democrats. They were all in on Bryan and the Democrats in the 1896 election. They didn't run their own separate candidates. When the Democrats lost, there was pretty much no more populist party to speak of. So the Populist Party, their defeat in the 1896 election and kind of the aftermath, there's two things that we'll say about the Populist Party and their significance. First is that the Populist Party is arguably the most significant significant third party in U.S. history. In fact, I think you're probably very hard pressed to find a third party that had more success than the Populists did. Um, Winning 6 senators is no easy feat. And the second thing that we'll say about the Populist Party and kind of the legacy of it and why it's important is that it really laid the groundwork and some of the ideas for future reforms. Many of the ideas that the populists had in the Omaha platform, those eventually do become a reality. They don't come a reality yet in the Gilded Age. Again, the Gilded Age is typically thought of as being kind of the supremacy of big business. And even though workers fought back, and even though farmers fought back, and they created their own parties, ultimately it was McKinley and big business, and that side that wins. But later on down the road, when we get to eras like the progressive movement, we see a lot of the ideas that the populists had kind of pop up a little bit later in American history. All right, on to the last section, section 7, the socialists. And the socialists were kind of a small group of people that maintained more radical ideas even after the downfall of the populists. So we'll call the socialists a small group who held, we'll just say, radical ideas about reform. And many of their ideas were inspired by Karl Marx, who was the German philosopher, historian, and economist who is considered to be like the founder of communism. We'll call him the founder of communism. And really, maybe more than the founder of communism, he is a critic of industrial capitalism. So very critical of what the American economy became in the Gilded Age, critic of industrial capitalism. And essentially from Marx's ideas, his theory stated that essentially in industrial society, society and the economy was breaking down into two main classes. One class was called the bourgeoisie. These are the factory owners, right? In terms of the language that Marx used, he would call this the means of production. So there were people who owned the factories. This would be your Rockefellers, your Carnegies. These are essentially big business. Everybody else is into this class called the proletariat, and these are the urban workers. Essentially, they don't own anything, they don't possess anything. The only thing that they own is their labor. And Marx predicted that conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat would lead to what he called a communist revolution. That was kind of Marx's idea. But the idea was that in industrial society, it's the bourgeoisie that represses the proletariat. Proletariat gets repressed or repressed so much to the point that they have no other choice but to rise up in revolution. So this is very much an ideology that looks at the class differences, right? It's really kind of a rich versus poor, we might say. And these sorts of ideas were influential to some thinkers in the United States. Now, there is technically a difference between socialism and communism. Maybe we'll just kind of illustrate the point a little bit here for the sake of clarity. So, for example, the economy, the way in which the United States was economy was organized at the time was a capitalist economy, right, or capitalism. And in terms of capitalism, when it comes to the means of production, aka the factories, they're owned by individuals. And according to Marx, as long as things like private property existed, as long as individuals owned the means of production, they would continue to exploit the people who didn't own it. And so, therefore, private property and individual ownership needed to be abolished. Now, the question is, what's going to replace it? Well, in communism, things are communally owned. That is, all the workers who work in the factory own the factory themselves. And a lot of socialists and communists advocated for things like factories to be communally owned by all of the workers. And so, therefore, everyone has kind of a stake in the work. Socialism, in some ways, is kind of a stopgap. And socialism refers to government ownership. So the idea to kind of move the economy or society from one step to another is to first, and this is what the technical difference between socialism and communism would be, but it would be to start from a capitalist society, have the government take over all the factories first, and it would be the people working through the government. The government would be like an agent for the people. And then once the government had taken over ownership, then you could transition to a communist society. This sort of communal ownership, the abolition of private property, the erasure of all distinctions of class, right? These were very much kind of idealistic, but oftentimes socialism and communism are kind of lumped together in the same category. So some of these ideas continued to be popular in the United States, even after the 1890s and into the early 1900s. Some communist or socialist organizations include organizations like the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. They were also called the Wobblies. The IWW was more prominent, we might say more prominent in the West. And in some cases, more willing to use violence. That was always kind of a debate within socialists, communists, or even worker union circles was, is violence acceptable and should it be used? And organizations were more willing to do that. Some organizations weren't. Big Bill Haywood, he was the leader of the IWW. IWW. Other socialist organizations said, well, instead of kind of getting right to the revolution that Karl Marx talked about, maybe we ought to work within the existing systems, i.e., the existing capitalist economic system and existing political system, in order to bring about changes that socialists would enjoy. And so the Socialist Party of America was established as a political party for socialists. Again, this would have been more moderate than the IWW. Really didn't have a lot of interest in like getting elected. They chose Eugene Debs, the leader of the Pullman strike, to run for president in 1912. He ran for president in 1912. And kind of fun fact, he was actually in prison at the time. Prison. I'm currently recording this as of January 2024, so stay tuned, see if there's somebody else running for president from prison. But he ended up earning 6% of the total vote. So there's definitely some appetite for socialism out there, but it's still a very small section of the country. Now, the socialists never really succeeded in the United States like they did in other parts of the world, and there were kind of several reasons for that. Your textbook mentions these three. First is that the progressive movement, and this is in a later chapter, they took a lot of socialist ideas. The progressives are going to be less radical, less revolutionary than the socialists are. They kind of want to work exclusively within the system. They want to kind of fine tune the system. But a lot of the things that the socialists were advocating for, the progressives were also advocating for. And when people were given an option, they said, look, I think I'm just going to go with the progressives instead. They essentially want many of the same things. The second reason was that it was not or incompatible with American values. Now, the textbook does not sort of elaborate on exactly what those values are. So there's kind of a wide range of things that one can choose from. We could probably guess that individualism is one. We can definitely see something like ethnicity, right? Americans tend to not view themselves as part of a class. They don't say, oh, I'm working class or I'm middle class. Americans tend to view themselves in terms of ethnicity. I'm Italian, I'm Jewish, I'm African American, and that serves as kind of a barrier for class unification. So again, it's kind of vague in the text in terms of what American values means, but we might think of these two things. And the last thing is government censorship. And that is to say that some of the ideas that the socialists and communists were espousing were certainly deemed dangerous by the United States government, and they had a vested interest in ensuring that these ideas didn't spread.